after the Sharpeville massacre, about 6 weeks or so later, all these organizations were banned. And various people were imprisoned from Sobukwe upwards, and people then began to consider the underground struggle. People began to get banned and so on. And by the time my generation went to high school, we were bereft of any political leaders, save those that had been chosen for us by the apartheid state, the collaborators, and some of them are still around.
I see.
The persons who were banned tended to stay out of any activities. Many of them obeyed the conditions of the banning order to the hilt, and they would not want to be interacted with lest they fall foul of the provisions of the banning order and then find themselves being arrested and imprisoned and whatever. So I guess the lack of leadership is there were those people who were in some kinds of leadership positions, but we didn't see it. We didn't see that leadership. They didn't show it. And they were known for having been politically active, but now were very much in the background. And we engaged with a variety of them and across the political spectrum, and realized, by the way, we can't rely on any of them to engage with us in terms of developing a political awareness campaign, which we got into in the late 60s and through the 70s. So we essentially did it on our own. And hence, I think, in a way, when Steve Biko said, "Black man, you're on your own," meant, well, you're on your own now, you need to do something about it, because you cannot rely on any of these icons. The Mandelas were in jail, and the late 60s and early 70s, they had no profile. Save for the Winnie Mandelas of this world, who kept the flame going. I dare say that if it weren't for Winnie, Mandela would not have got to the iconic status he got to on his release. Now it's 1990 that he was released. It's 20 years later. So he would not have. And she kept that going. And I think against some opposition from others, particularly those who may have been in exile and felt, well, why push Mandela when we've got other leaders? Although that wasn't the position with Tambo. So the people inside were essentially ourselves. There were the Griffiths and Klenges of this world who were attorneys and so on, and we engaged with them. We did. But because the focus of the security police was on us, they tended to shy away. So whenever they saw us, they would make excuses not to be seen with us. And you have in the late 60s, early 70s, some of those people had their banning orders rescinded or they ended. Mewaram Gobin is one, and he engaged, resuscitated the Natal Indian Congress, where we tended to proliferate because that was another avenue, and we became active and effectively reshaped what they would have done as a political organization. So outside of the few people we felt, well, they played a role, we will give them the credit for it, we were actually our own leaders, and we created the internal momentum we created the consciousness and engaged in massive conscientization of our fellow youth cohort. So it is that there's nobody who is in their 60s now and below, into their 40s, who has not gone through the Black consciousness ideology, if you like, in some way. They're in cabinet, they're in business, they're in community organizations, and they were influenced by that ethos. When Vusi, Kader, Sunny, and the others were arrested, that was something that was quite different, because these weren't people who were from exile. They were, although they got involved with people who came in through the underground and left a trail, and that's how they got arrested, but these were people amongst us. And so we knew them, and we engaged in an awareness campaign around that. So we created meetings, we created artistic expressions where we raised funds to support the detainees or their families. So we did that in 1971. And in one such play, I forget what the name of the play was, but it was in the then Bolton Hall in Albert Street, where we had this performance. The security police let a smoke bomb go to disrupt it was actually a smoke with tear gas in it. So it disrupted the performance and so on. But we continued after that. So there would be those kinds of things, they would stop us, arrest us, question us, those kinds of things. So even the unity movement people were afraid to support their own detainees, but we weren't. So that, I think, engendered a certain respect and fondness from a lot of their families. Sunny's wife engaged with us because she knew that we were the ones who were creating the awareness around her husband's detention, and we tried in our little way to do something to support them.
My next kind of random question. You talked about the youth of 1976 and the lack of leadership, and I'm just wondering if you find any parallels between the youth of today with a lack of leadership as well, and because this play is slowly beginning to evolve around the idea of looking to Robben Island and looking to Shakespeare for leadership for the younger generation. I'm just wondering if you can find any parallels between.
Well, look, I think the youth has leadership. It's a different kind of leadership, but it's a different era. It may be that some of that leadership is misguided, but there is the leadership. And what is palpably different from then and now is the ability to say what you want, even though it may be corny and it may come out in laughable, lampooning sound bites, but we do have that leadership. I don't think are misdirected. I think they are influenced by the milieu. What is the milieu? The milieu is one where you create a personal trajectory for yourself by getting involved in certain structures, so that in 5, 10, 15 years' time, you will end up becoming a cabinet minister or a multi-millionaire. And so my two sons are in, the one is 20 and the other is 22. And my daughter is 16, and all of them know that if you want to get anywhere, you want to get the lucrative contracts and you want the tenders, join X organization now, so that you take care of the future in a few years' time. And that has, in a sense, developed a cynicism amongst youth that is dangerous, because youth cannot afford to be cynical about anything. Skeptical, yes, because you're questioning and you want to know whether is that what so-and-so is saying correct or not, and you want to challenge. But the cynicism that is developing, I think, is a legacy of leadership that has tended to look after itself, has tended to look after those that are close to them, and then created a terrible model for youth to follow. So I don't blame the youth for that. I think that indeed, when youth become diplomatic, then you've got a problem. They ought to be able to say whatever they want to say. So Malema should say what he wants to say. And watching him over the last 18 months or so, he's improved. The more he interacts in the public eye, his verbiage has improved, his grammar has improved, his ability to poke fun in the right places has increased in a very serious way. So I think if you look at that group, he surely will be a cabinet minister, if not higher, in the future. Does South Africa deserve that? I think we deserve the leadership we get at any point in time. With any country deserves the leadership it gets. And classic examples are, for instance, in the US, where intellectuals will cringe until Obama arrived. Between Clinton and Obama, you had a spate of George Bushism that thinking Americans cringed around. But people voted for that leadership. And indeed, the second time around, he won with a resounding victory. So leadership emerges for a period. It's thrust up. And like Shakespeare said, some leaders are born and others, have it thrust on them. So you get the leadership that is appropriate, I think, for the set of circumstances. So we as intellectuals should not imagine that political leadership should be construed of massive grey matter and so on. And it's not true. The world over, it's not true. There was a short period in the UK when the previous Labour Prime Minister enthused newer people, but lost it very quickly. Became essentially George Bush's emissary in the UK and elsewhere. In the US, the same kind of thing has happened until you now have a more erudite American president. So I think that the world of politics, in some senses, is normalizing much more than we would have expected, given our history of commitment, of principled involvement in struggle. Because you got involved in struggle because there was no alternative. For many of us, that was the thing you had to do. The alternative would have been devastating. Intellectually, emotionally, it would have made us lesser people, I think, lesser beings, if we didn't involve ourselves. And I think we didn't involve ourselves knowing that in so many years' time, we would now tend to exploit the system because we would now claim payback. And so quite a few of us have decided we're not playing the political game and we're continuing to do what we want to do. We're poorer for it in terms of material things, but I think richer for it in terms of principle and commitment.
That kind of leads me on to my next question, because you talk about, again, the older generation not being able to answer the younger generation because I think what your quote is something like, well, we went through the struggle and that's all you need to know about. So that's why we can enrich ourselves. And that's what my next question was. Can you just elaborate on that?
That I think is a betrayal of everything that has been noble in our struggle. It has created the sleaze factor. It's led to the ignobility of being associated with the demolition of the previous system, because people gave their lives. There are thousands of heroes that have gone unrecognized in our country. There are thousands of people who've contributed in different ways, and I don't think many of them go around looking for acclamation. They don't go around with these weights on their shoulders. There are a few who have been seriously disappointed in a few things they've done, and as a result, they've gotten old before their time. They've taken to self-destructive things, some of them, booze and so on, and essentially have destroyed themselves. But it's because of that gap between struggle and power, and how you mediate the gap between those two. And do you do it with integrity, the means justifying the ends, or the other way around? And so a few of those people have benefited, and I think they are role models for the Malemas and others of this world, who, when they say, if you want to drink good wine, if you want to go to good restaurants, then you know you need to do X, and they do it themselves. So that's the legacy, if you like, of leadership that has allowed itself to be seduced by personal gain, by the materialism that necessarily must come with power. Because you see, to have a Ho Chi Minh or a Gandhi or a Nehru or a Mwalimu in Tanzania, those are exceptions. The rest tend to collect the accoutrement of power and whatever else goes with it as privilege, and then justify it as entitlement. They see it as something that they've given a certain part of their lives for, and sure enough, that's what I deserve. And that's a terrible thing, and it tends to corrode even the best of souls. I think Nelson Mandela recognized that in his first year in power, and that's when he decided, well, I'm giving a certain percentage of my wage bill from the state to charity. And he did that. None of his comrades did it. He did it recognizing what he had to deal with. But in a sense, he contributed to that, because the pay scales changed and the benefits changed dramatically at that point. 94, 95, they changed very drastically, because now for the first time you had full-time politicians. Previously you had part-time politicians. So going with that will come getting fat, literally and otherwise.
Can I carry on? Is that kind of a question? You spoke about some of the plays you did in, I believe they were in Robben Island, and you talked about the Antigone. I just wondered, I'm trying to, if that was the Antigone that Ampel Fugard and John Carney talked about in The Island. Do you know the play The Island?
Yes.
That is that one.
What
are your memories of that Antigone? On Robben Island. It was the Antigone on Robben Island.
Well, no, it wasn't. We did the play in 1970. 71, 72. It was Jean Anouilh's version that we changed. So Antigone represented, Antigone being young, represented ourselves as the cry for equity, if you like, justice, against Creon, who represented the apartheid state. So that was how reconfigured that particular play. And it attracted a lot of attention from lots of quarters that we shouldn't have attracted the attention of, like the security police that got hold of actors. There's a well-known actor, Hayes. I think it's there's a theatre named after him, the Alhambra. One of the Richard Haynes. Richard Haynes was cast as Creon, obviously being white, and our Antigone was black female. So it provided the excellent counterpoint, if you like, for the apartheid state versus black struggle. And the security police went to his parents, and his parents had to really tell him not to associate himself with us. So Richard Haynes moved on and stayed away for at least a year or two. He just went underground, if you like, and then re-emerged, and was a great actor. So I think it was a week before we were due to open that he disappeared. So I stepped in as Creon, and the play was very successful and created, people immediately identified and created the kind of awareness and made people talk and so on. So we took the Greek version, we took Anui's version, and we decided we needed a South African version, if you like, which was loosely constructed around the Anui one. And it played through 72, and then in 73 we were banned and house arrested. Those of us who lived in cities were house arrested. So that theatre group was called the Theatre Council of Natal. It was a shortened form, TECON, TECON. And John Carney, all those we interacted with in festivals and in other engagements where we created a Black Theatre Association and so on. And this was about 72, 73. And thereafter, we couldn't participate in what we wanted to do. So in our early 20s, we were house arrested from 6 a.m. in the morning to 6 p.m. You could leave your apartment, but from 6 in the afternoon, you had to, it was self-imprisonment, effectively. You had to be inside your door. And from Saturday, 2 p.m. to Monday, 6 a.m., you were effectively in an apartment, and you could not be with more than one person at a time. Otherwise, it would be regarded as being in a crowd, because the definition of a crowd was 3 people. And you could not communicate with anybody else who was banned. Now, I lived in this apartment with my mother and my 2 younger brothers. My brother, 2 years younger than I, was also banned. So here we had the situation: he was banned, I was banned. We're living in the same apartment, and it created for quite a few escapades with security police attention at odd hours. There wasn't a week, literally, where there wasn't some security police interference, surveillance, etc. And you must remember that this was the early 70s. The year that we were banned was 73 into 74, and there was no other activity, no other political activity. These other organizations that had been banned and located themselves abroad would send people into the country every now and then, and probably cop them out again to the police to create propaganda, which was called armed propaganda. So you'd say, well, so and so and so and so and so is on trial now for Mkhonto activities or whatever. But that was the only visibility you had. So in that period, the Bantustanization of the country was accelerated phenomenally, to the point where when I got to Robben Island, my group got to Robben Island we got there in December 76, And then into 77, when we engaged with the other prisoners where this Bible was located in, it's now called B section, right? The name's changed over time, but its last name was B section. And Mandela himself asked about the Bantustans. The Bantustans. Was this not a viable mechanism? Old man Mbeki asked about he compared the 1905 Dumas in Russia with an altruism position that you got in and you had your people in to create the visibility, and we said we oppose that because you rather create the external opposition than have that kind of involvement where very few people were principled. Gachagutulezi claims he was, but we oppose that. We oppose that, and we were the only ones who, on a principle, said if you participate with the enemy, there's very little difference between you and that enemy because you become an appendage of that enemy. It's like playing with toy telephones. Do you really have his master's voice? Or are you playing, at some point the battery's going to run down? And it's part of our legacy now that some of those collaborators are sitting in the ruling party. Indeed, the National Party, we are in struggle, failed to kill the National Party, the upholder of apartheid. The man who we don't give credit for destroying the National Party is its last leader, who's now a cabinet minister in the ANC government. So Martinus van Schalkwyk, the last leader of the National Party, well, probably not single-handedly, but succeeded in closing down the hated National Party representing apartheid, which all of us in struggle failed to do. And perhaps that's why the ANC has been kind to him, and he's been one of the better performing cabinet ministers. But those are the colossal ironies we have in the South African situation. And when anybody raises issues of history or the recent past, because we haven't had even a generation yet between 94 and now, and everyone expects that it would have turned around phenomenally. So when some of those issues are raised, people then say, well, you're playing the race card, you haven't moved on, etc., etc. But you see, if you look economically, if you have not been exposed to an ethos of understanding and playing the stock exchange, understanding and controlling capital and the means of production, as a new entrepreneur, you got a lifetime of learning. And it comes through experience. There's no other experience but that experience. So do you expect that those people, the new entrepreneurs, are going to become overnight successful? Well, some of them will, but not all of them. So you still have the legacy of economic control, economic development, if you like, in former minority white hands. And they've allowed a few people in, and that's it. And those have now successfully acted as gatekeepers. So why do you need so and so? Because I'm there. You need me. I'm the black face. That's the only face you need. So we've got these massive contradictions in society, and every now and then they reflect themselves in some outpouring and some protest action, and the media calls it xenophobia. There's no xenophobia. It's Afrophobia, because really, who are we turning against? We're turning against people who look like us, but maybe from north of the border, and they're extremely vulnerable. So we look at them as taking our women, taking our jobs, and so on. And that is part of the legacy, the creation of this legacy that I'm talking about. the contradictions that have resulted in that kind of attitude. So people will think more ethnically, and people will say that Malema is looking after the Pedis. We thought that Zuma would look after the Zulus, but really it's Malema who's looking after the Pedis. Now that's the kind of craziness you get in a system where we then look at how to pigeonhole people rather than look at what is it that they can contribute, what is it, and also what is it that makes them human. Because in doing that, we debase ourselves and undermine the other's humanity.
That's my next one. Your choice of Hamlet. Does it? You had mentioned that it reflects today, so 14 months ago, crisis of leadership. You also said that it reflected the conditions of the time. Do you remember the choice that you made? It was from Hamlet. Can you just speak a little bit? Do you believe it still reflects today's crisis of leadership?
Yes, and that's, because at that time, as I told you before, I was sort of putting off Sunny to say, yes, I'll do it. And I also realized that some of the choice passages were taken because he'd obviously been at it for a while before I arrived in that section. And I chose that section to put my name to because it reflected the treachery, the inability of people to come to terms with certain issues, and the crisis of leadership. And I believe that we're still facing that. There was a period of tremendous hope post the election in May. And I think that for many people, there will be certain deliverables that will happen. But I don't know, and maybe this is a pessimism, I don't know whether we're going to get the bureaucrats really committed to doing what they're paid to do. And that, I think, is where there's going to be further failure. So part of that is also a crisis of leadership. I think that half of them should be fired. And new people brought on board because there are new graduates. Every year there are thousands of new graduates, people who can ably take some of those positions. And maybe some of them are not ready for higher positions, but then in 2 to 3 years' time, with the exposure, they will be. But will we do that? No, we won't do that, because very few people in top leadership want to really deal with the harsh reality, because it's got comebacks. If you fire certain echelons, it will have negative consequences. I think the public, though, in this country will see a real change, because they will then realize that this leadership is worth following. This leadership means what it says and wants to create some delivery. In no other country in the world do we talk about service delivery as if it's an issue. In this country, it's service delivery. It's basically people who are paid who are not doing what they're paid to do. And that is unconscionable, particularly in a country like ours, where we've got, a Gini coefficient. If you ignore that it was a fascist who created the Gini coefficient, it's huge, it's massive. We've overtaken countries like Brazil that were leading before, and they've put their heads to the wheel and have turned things around. Us, I think that people are still watching their shadows, looking in front, looking on the side, and behind. So I don't think we're going to get that kind of change in a hurry. It needs brassy, bold, and principled leaders, notwithstanding the unpopularity of the decisions.
Sunny was talking about that over the festive season, you guys would put on extracts from plays, and I would just love to hear a little more about that, a little more about the form that those took, about the extracts chosen. He was talking about Coriolanus, Antigone. He said you guys did something from Beckett, I think, and
that was more sort of informal thing where we people who were interested sort of, did what they needed to do, I think, to amuse themselves. I used the festive period to get something like that going, because any organized form of theatre, discussions, etc., were not allowed. The prison authorities would not allow them. So it was advantage taken of the festive season, and that people could do these things. So it was more informal than organized from my memory, but Sunny may be closer to it because it was close to his heart. And all those would have been done to the extent that people remembered those things without the actual scripts in front of them. So the only works that were available were those that were prescribed. The library ended up, in the last few years of my imprisonment there, in the 80s, early 80s, having a repository of the provincial library. So whatever was there in the provincial library would be there. But then we could look at the catalogue and order these books. So we had a fairly decent library there. So, but by then I don't think people were doing those things. You see, because there was other activity. There were movies. So sometimes, there were 2 or 3 movies playing a day. And it was all sheer escapism. So it was another day taken. And we took over what was called the Social Sporting Club, whatever it was called. I know Tokyo claims he was whatever in that time, but what we did was we ordered movies from the catalogue of the provincial library, and they had some good movies. They had lots of documentaries and some short films. These were all 16 mm. And then there was a catalogue of movies that could be hired using sports fund money. But previously the warders would choose the movie. So we saw all of Clint Eastwood's spaghetti western stuff and so on, until eventually some of us said, you know what, this is ridiculous. We're watching things that we really don't want to watch. Some of them were okay, but others were badly made. The dubbing was poor. Even though Morricone's music came to the rescue, but you could still hear the Italian behind it and stuff like that. So we said, why don't we choose the movies? So eventually the head of prison agreed, and we chose very good movies. The warders didn't like them because it was not their typical cowboy gangster flicks, but they would still view the movie before we would, in case there was content there. We were beyond being seduced by any ism that we're already not part of. And that's the stupidity of the prison system. So they probably should have exposed us to porn or something like that, because that had no political content whatsoever. But I suppose it was keeping to the apartheid rubric of we shall not allow 1, 2, 3. So if there were interracial scenes, if there was a black man on top, etc. So and anything that was vaguely protest oriented. Where they'd come through is in the westerns again, where it was the bad gringos versus the natives who were eventually rescued by some good Samaritan and created an uprising. So, but it was all smoke and mirrors, because they saw the form but didn't look at some of the content. So they missed now that the bad guys were part of a repressive system. So it was that kind of thing that would come through. So subtlety wasn't, it had to be really in your face for them to